Buenos días. Me gusta mucho la oportunidad de ser aquí en México, el país de mis nietes. Disculpa, no habla español muy bien, and so we go to English. I'm going to talk about my most recent book, The Predictioneer's Game, and predicting the future. Now, it happens that people have been interested in predicting the future as long as there have been people. And they've done lots of different methods. They've looked up at the stars, and they've looked in tea leaves, and they've cut up sheep, very unpleasant for the sheep. And all of those methods have something in common. They don't work. What I want to talk about today is something that does work, and that is game theory. Now, game theory kind of puts me in an awkward position with many others on the panel, because game theory assumes that people are rationally self-interested. Now, by rational, I mean something different than the way many on the panel have used the term. I don't mean that people achieve perfection. I don't mean that people examine every possible alternative. In fact, that's irrational. Once the cost of looking at more alternatives exceeds the expected gain, it is not rational to continue searching. It is rational to satisfy. And I don't mean anything about what it is that people are trying to achieve, but rather I mean something about the actions that they take given whatever it is that they want. They take actions that they think will advance their self-interests. Now, we can characterize people as having values and beliefs. There are things that they want, and there are things that they believe about others, about themselves, about their capabilities, about the environment that they're in, the context in which they have to make decisions. And an important part of those beliefs is that they recognize that whenever they have to make a decision, they face constraints. And the biggest constraint, besides what you're capable of, is that there are other people who want things different from what you want. And so they want to advance their interests, and they want to get in the way of your interests. So the problem of game theory, or the problem of understanding how people behave, is a much harder problem, for instance, than the problem of physicists. I'm always amazed that that's called the hard sciences. It's so easy. Physicists worry about particles that interact, but the particles don't interact strategically. If I take this and I throw it at the wall, no molecules rearrange in anticipation of hitting the wall, but if I take it and I throw it at one of you, you're going to prepare and catch it. Or worse, come charging up here and beat me up or whatever. And that's the problem of predicting human behavior, working out how people interact strategically. Now, there are lots of things that game theory can do to help us, and there are also lots of things it can't do and it shouldn't do. Game theory, because it is grounded in mathematical logic, is transparent. So if an argument is made from a game theoretic perspective, we can explain exactly how the conclusions were reached, as opposed to asking somebody what they think, getting their gut feel, and having no idea of how they arrived at their decision. And because we can figure out what the assumptions are and how they led to conclusions, we can argue with them. What if we assumed something different? How would that change outcomes? That means that we can facilitate resolving disputes. It also means that we can evaluate how uncertainty shapes choices and makes things complicated. We can evaluate risks. We can evaluate cheating, because a rational person will cheat if they think it's to their advantage. We can distinguish opportunities to cooperate with other people from situations in which that's just not going to work out. We can tell the difference between when people make cheap talk statements that don't cost them anything and costly statements that are probably credible. Towards the end of the talk, I'm going to discuss the upcoming Copenhagen negotiations and Iran, and I'm going to argue a lot of what is cheap talk in both of those. That is, statements that have no real bite. They don't mean anything. Now, there are things game theory can't do, of course, lots of things. Game theory does not address the use of emotion, except in those cases where people use emotion strategically. That is, it's not sincere emotion. It's not sudden rage or sudden pleasure. It is calculated. But most of the time, emotion isn't like that, and game theory doesn't address that. And it can't make you more powerful, more influential, smarter, more skillful than you are. You have whatever package of abilities you have, but it can help you to use them as effectively as possible. And no model should ever substitute for good judgment, but neither should we make the mistake of thinking that wisdom and good judgment are clear substitutes, preferable substitutes for rigorous scientific analysis. Why? Because wisdom is something that we tend to recognize after the fact, not before the fact. Somebody winds up with a good result, we say, they were wise. But beforehand, we don't know that they were wise, and we lots of times wind up with very bad decisions. So we want to be careful about that. So who's rational? Mother Teresa was rational. Suicide bombers are rational. Pretty much everybody is rational. I've had some psychiatrists tell me that I'm wrong in saying that I only know of two groups of people who are irrational. They tell me they may be rational also. 2-year-olds, because 2-year-olds don't have well-formed preferences, and schizophrenics, because they're not capable of well-formed preferences. Okay, how might we go about modeling rational choices, self-interested choices in a strategic environment? Well, we have to think about who's going to try to influence a decision. So, for instance, if we were talking about Iran, a natural thing would be to look at the President of the United States and say, well, there's somebody who is going to exert a lot of influence over what happens in negotiations between the international community and Iran over its nuclear program. But let's be honest. President Obama is a very smart man. He doesn't know much about Iran. So he has advisors. He has a Secretary of State. He has a Secretary of Defense. He has a National Security Advisor. He has a Director of Intelligence. He has a very, very, very smart Secretary of Energy, Nobel Prize winner in physics. But let's face it, none of them know a lot about Iran either. So the advisors have advisors. And pretty quickly we see that if we want to analyze a problem, we need to be paying attention to a lot of layers of people who try to shape decisions, not just the one or two people at the top, because those one or two people are going to be pushed this way and that way by the people they seek advice from. And of course, we don't want to just look at one side. Every problem has at least two sides, and usually more. Now imagine a problem with as few as 5 decision makers. Those 5 decision makers each want to know what the other is going to do, maybe want also to know what each other thinks the remainder will do, and what they think the others will do, and so on. So that with 5 decision makers, there are up to 120 interactions that we might care about. We could manage that. A smart person could keep that straight in their head. With just 10 decision makers or 10 influencers, still a small group, most problems have many more, there are 3.6 million possible interactions. Nobody can keep that straight in their head, and in the fine print, I will admit, I don't care about all of those. I care about 1,440 of them. They're critical, but you can't keep that straight in your head either. It's too much. And therefore, something like a computer-based model capturing a game is a way to go, because you see, computers, unlike us, don't need vacations, don't have a union, don't need coffee breaks, don't need lunch breaks, don't need to sleep, and they have fabulous memories, so they can keep track of lots of information. So I solve a game, this is a very simplified representation of the game, in which people make decisions about what to propose or ask other people to do. They get responses that may be supportive, they may be adversarial, and so forth. And they're doing that in an environment where they're uncertain about who they're dealing with. Is the other guy a hawk who would rather punch me in the nose to get his way? Or is he a dove who would prefer to negotiate, even if it means making some concessions, but avoiding the costs of a fight? Is the other guy the kind of person who, if I punch him in the nose, will punch me back, or throw up his hand and say, oh, now I see that you're serious, I give up? We don't know those things when we deal with people. We also don't know how long the process of coming to a decision will take. So it's a very complicated problem, and you might think, well, it's too complicated for people to do. After all, most of us aren't very good at mathematics, and solving these things requires quite a bit of mathematics. Math is actually pretty easy compared to, for example, if you play Frisbee with a dog, and you throw the Frisbee up in the air, and the dog runs forward, jumps up, and catches the Frisbee, ask a mathematician to write down the equations that represent the calculation of the angle and velocity of the Frisbee's trajectory, where it will peak, where it will come down. The dog seems to have figured out how far to run and how high to jump. And I'm confident that we are not only smarter than Daniel Dennett's sheep robots, we're smarter than dog robots too. So we intuitively work out what the mathematician laboriously writes down as equations. Okay, so to solve a model, to predict how people will interact, what do we need to know? Mindful that if we are able to predict, we may also be able to engineer and improve outcomes, which is what my objective is in life, to make the world a better place. Turns out we don't really need to know very much to predict. We need to know who has a stake in the decision. Not just who are the decision makers, but who's going to try to influence them. Who's going to lobby? Who's going to protest? Who's going to organize? And we need to know what it is that each of those influencers want, or say they want. We can't know what in their heart of hearts they want, because they have an incentive to lie and bluff and tell us things different from the truth. But we can know what they say they want, because they say it. We can know how focused they are. How willing are they to drop what they are doing when the problem comes up and attend to it rather than something else? How influential could they be? How much clout could they exert to persuade people? And how resolved are they in their position? Are they the sort of people who are very eager for an agreement, even if it means not getting what they want? Or committed to going down in a blaze of glory, standing by what they want, knowing that it will lose? If we know those things, then we can calculate what their choices are, what the risks and chances are that they can take, what it is that they are valuing, and what they believe about others. And that's all we need to know. That's 4 numbers for every person trying to influence a decision. Just 4 numbers. And if we know that information, we can calculate what they will do. So then the question is that something that you should believe? I'm going to go through this part very quickly. The CIA says this works 90% of the time. I've also published hundreds of predictions in peer-reviewed journal articles. You can go check those out. Academics say those are also right about 90% of the time. And we have the embarrassing testimonials by Nobel laureates saying this is pretty clever, and business people and former head of the CIA. Okay, enough of that. It's embarrassing. Where would you get the information about those 4 numbers? Well, if you have a problem that you care about, you've paid attention to who are the people that are impediments to you, and you're going to be able to estimate that. I teach an undergraduate class called Solving Foreign Crises, in which my students work out these data on some of the biggest problems in the world just by trolling the web and finding information. And they get an awful lot right. So let's take a look at Copenhagen, because I think all of us would like to see Copenhagen be a great success. And many of us are probably optimistic about Copenhagen, and I'm afraid I'm here to put a damper on that. So the question is, what are the long-term commitments of the international community to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? One of the arguments that we've heard is because pollution is a collective bad, we need universal action. I'm going to argue with that. So what we want to do is we want to identify trends in the support or opposition to regulating greenhouse gas emissions and see if we can find a better solution than Copenhagen. Why do I want a better solution? Let's look back for a moment at Kyoto. 175 countries signed the Kyoto Agreement, not including the United States, but 175. And Kyoto typified what the effort at universal agreements looks like. Universal agreements have 2 characteristics. Either they get very high compliance because they don't ask people to change their behavior, or they ask people to change their behavior, but they impose no costs for violating what they promised to do. So Kyoto, on average, called for a 5.2% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and this led to a lot of optimism. 137 of the 175 signatories to Kyoto had as their commitment, what they signed on for, is to report on what progress they were making. They had no standard they had to meet. And so every year they could come forward, 137 out of 175. We are very proud to report this year that we are in full compliance with our agreement under the Kyoto Protocol. We have done nothing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We are in complete compliance. Well, that is the lowest common denominator. This is not a very good way to correct greenhouse gas emissions. What about the other 38? The ones who actually were committed to changing their behavior. They pretty much in lockstep got online shortly after Kyoto and announced that they couldn't meet the standards they'd agreed to. Japanese, the hosts, said, well, very well-intentioned, really would like to do well. Can't do it, can't meet the standard. British, the same thing, and so on. That is the nature of universal pacts. There were no consequences for those announcements that we can not meet the standard we promised. We signed our names to honor. That's cheap talk. It didn't cost them anything to say, sorry, can't do it. That is the nature of universal agreements. So we have to ask, why do we pursue a universal treaty when some of the biggest polluters, like my country, the United States, could unilaterally act to correct the problem? Not completely, but partially. How? Well, for instance, we could raise taxes in the United States on gasoline, heavily subsidized in Mexico, so you drive more than you would if it were at the market price. We could raise taxes on gasoline, and we could raise taxes on produce, because fertilizer is an even bigger greenhouse gas emitter than gasoline. And we could take some of that money from the taxes, and we could turn it over to poor governments that would like to see better greenhouse gas control, but are poor. And they look back, like India does, and says, well, you guys have been polluting for 200 years. We've just started. We're trying to climb up economically. We could transfer that money. I often ask my students, how many of you are willing to give up, you care about poor people, and so forth. How many of you are willing to give up your cell phone and contribute that money to poor people who will adopt better energy sources? Out of a class of 275, when I ask that question, usually 3 hands go up. It's cheap talk. They want to do what's good if somebody else will pay the price. And our politicians look for universal treaties rather than unilateral action, because unilaterally raising taxes is not a good way to get reelected, at least not in the United States. So universal treaties become an excuse. Well, we would cut our pollution, but the Chinese and the Indians won't, instead of finding a way to compensate them. So here's a little study I did. This may be hard to read. There's a horizontal line at 50. That's the Kyoto standard. Anything above that is better. And you can see that there's going to be a feel-good agreement, according to me at least, that comes out of Copenhagen, that will have a higher standard than Kyoto. And you can see that the trend is steadily down. You can see the 95% confidence interval around it is pretty tight. The time is not written stone, but this is a slow-moving process. Gradually, what we're going to see is dropping even lower than the Kyoto standards. Why? Because it will be technology instead of international agreements that is much more likely to solve the problem. And that's a key strategic implication. Seeking universal treaties, at least from a game theoretic perspective, is an exercise in cheap talk. It goes to the lowest common denominator. You get compliance by not asking people to change their behavior. You don't punish the people who say they will change their behavior. That's why they sign on. And it just makes us all feel good and doesn't produce results. Okay, how about Iran? Back in February, at the TED conference, I made 3 predictions about Iran. What are they going to do about their nuclear program? What's going to happen to the theocratic regime? How are things looking for the student dissidents? Very quickly, the yellow bars are the data that were put into the model back in January of 2009. The gray bars are prediction. These are not updated. This is a prediction about what the world would look like in Iran today. And the white bars are what it is likely to look like in 2011. There's a very important set of things to see here, which I have to go through very quickly. Notice in January 2009, the strongest support in Iran, overwhelmingly, close to a majority, was to build a bomb. And there was also a lot of support for even more extreme behavior, not only build but test a bomb. And that was the predicted policy pursuit at that time. Currently, you can see that bar has been reduced. There is nobody anymore supporting testing a bomb, according to this, in Iran. What there is a majority of the power, of the clout, of the influence, is now centered around developing weapon-grade fuel, enough to build a bomb, but not to actually build a bomb. That gets a little bit worse if an agreement isn't reached by 2011. The white bar grows at the build a bomb, but it's still, the majority is against building a bomb. And we can see here the solid red line shows Khamenei's power declining, Ahmadinejad pretty flat, government being taken over by the military and so forth. I have to go very fast, so we'll skip that. Very quickly, that was back in February. October 14th, New York Times reported that the International Atomic Energy Agency said they found no evidence that Iran was trying to build a bomb. September 9th, 2009, the New York Times reported that American intelligence agencies have concluded that Iran deliberately, very important word, deliberately stopped short of the critical last steps to make a bomb, and so on. Unfortunately, they have rejected the IAEA proposal to transfer uranium, but from a game theorist's point of view, for the right reasons. It was a cheap talk agreement. They have no credible commitment that the enriched uranium would be returned to them. So I wrap up by saying that I want you to realize, of course, everything is not predictable. Lots of interesting things are not predictable, but an awful lot of things are predictable. And if we can predict things, then there's a pretty good prospect that we can also work out how to change not people's interests, but how to persuade them of how their interests can be advanced by changing their behavior and produce better outcomes. And that is, for me, the punchline of how to advance a better world. Thank you.
Bruce, just one question. First of all, two briefly questions. Of all your predictions, how much of them have been successful? What percentage?
So according to the CIA, based on a couple of thousand tests, more than 90%. According to academics, based on the published peer-reviewed articles, hundreds of predictions, also about 90%. So about 10% seem to be emotion and other things, bad data, whatever.
If you have 1 minute just to give an advice to the Middle East, how can we have, like Robert Wright mentioned, a non-zero game? A win-win situation.
Absolutely. Actually, in my book, The Predictioneer's Game, I have a section on how one might begin to make some real progress. For example, land for peace, peace for land, these lack credible commitment. They're bad arrangements. They're a waste of time. Suppose the Palestinians, as we know, believe that tourism is going to be their biggest industry. Suppose the Israelis and the Palestinians agreed that 60% of all tax revenue from tourism would go to the Israelis, 40% of all tax from tourism would go to the Palestinians. That's roughly the population distribution. It turns out that tourists are extremely sensitive to violence. One act of violence between the Israelis and the Palestinians results in approximately, if I remember the numbers correctly, 1,300 fewer tourists. Under conservative estimates, you can see the analysis in my book, under conservative analysis, this arrangement would have a neutral effect on the Israeli economy and would increase the gross domestic product of Palestine by 20%. Now, 20% growth, that's enough to incentivize people to police themselves, to control the more extreme elements that engage in violence on their side of the border, and the Israelis will have the same incentive on their side. And if they don't, we will just be in the status quo, nothing lost. It's only a win-win. There's no real downside to this.
A good tax, at least. Thank you very much.
Thank
Gracias.
you.